Hello, I'm John Eller, Director of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies here at Indiana University's School of Liberal Arts in Indianapolis on the IUPUI campus. I'm pleased to make this presentation for Charlotte Mecklenburg Library's Community Read events during National Library Week in April of 2014. The Center for Ray Bradbury Studies publishes the new Ray Bradbury Review, as well as collected stories of Ray Bradbury, a multi-volume series of the seldom-seen original versions of Ray Bradbury's earliest stories. You see these here on the shelf behind me. Also on the shelf to my left behind me, you will see other books that faculty here in the center have written about Ray Bradbury and about his literary works as well. Our staff is currently raising support to preserve and exhibit the papers, working library, awards, and mementos of Ray Bradbury. This wonderful archive was gifted to us recently by Ray Bradbury's family and by his close friend and lifelong associate, Don Albright. Ray Bradbury hated intolerant authority, as well as those who deny the existence of intolerance, regardless of the political orientation. He disliked authoritarian extremes of both the left and the far right. He wrote Fahrenheit 451 in response to the climate of fear that emerged during the McCarthy era in the early 1950s. But his literary inspiration was actually Arthur Koestler's 1940s novel Darkness at Noon, which revealed the intellectual holocaust of Stalin's Russia. In unpublished notes that Ray Bradbury used when he would give lectures in the 1950s, he said this about the origins of Fahrenheit. People have often asked me what effect Huxley and Orwell had on me, and whether either of them influenced the creation of Fahrenheit 451. The best response is Arthur Koestler. Only a few perceived the intellectual holocaust and the revolution by burial that Stalin achieved. Only Koestler got the full range of desecration, execution, and forgetfulness on a mass and nameless graveyard scale. Koestler's Darkness at Noon was therefore true father, mother, and lunatic brother to my Fahrenheit 451. As Ray Bradbury progressed on in post-war America in the late 1940s, he continued to write horror stories, he continued to write science fiction, he continued to write fantasy, but he became more and more concerned with what appeared to be the death of the imagination in American society. And he began to write a series of stories that touched on the nature of censorship. One of the first ones was titled Carnival of Madness, which eventually worked its way into the Martian Chronicles in 1950. Carnival of Madness tells the story of a rich man, a builder, who's very bitter about the fact that most literature has been banned in the future where he lives. And he builds a wonderful house of Usher containing all of Edgar Allan Poe's magical and horrifying ways of death from all of his stories, The Pit and the Pendulum, and so on and so forth. In that house he invites all the people who are responsible for censoring books in this future world, for destroying the imagination. And he explains to his architect exactly what that process had been. They began by controlling books and, of course, films, one way or another, one group or another, political bias, religious prejudice, union pressures. There was always a minority afraid of something, and a great majority afraid of the dark, afraid of the future, afraid of the past, afraid of the present, afraid of themselves, and shadows of themselves. Here Bradbury is really setting the stage, he's setting the atmosphere for what will be the background to Fahrenheit 451. It sounds almost, in those words, a counterpoint to what Captain Beatty tells the fireman Montag about the world they're living in. A few years later, in the late 40s, he also wrote a story called The Pedestrian, a story about a time in the far future where pedestrians are an endangered species. Nobody goes out anymore. Everybody sits around and watches their TV and watches and listens to whatever the government wants them to watch and listen to. He has his pedestrian walking down the street saying these words to himself. "Hello in there," he whispered to every house on every side as he moved. What's up tonight on Channel 4, Channel 7, Channel 9? A quiz? A review? A comedian falling off a stage? He stumbled over a particularly uneven section of sidewalk. The cement was vanishing under flowers and grass. In 10 years of walking, by night or day, for thousands of miles, he had never met another person walking, not one, in all that time. The Pedestrian was the true threshold experience in Bradbury's creativity leading into Fahrenheit. He would soon imagine another late solitary walker, Clarice McClellan, who turns when she hears Montag the fireman approaching. She smells the kerosene on his tunic, and she knows who he is, and she knows what he does. And there you have the beginning of the masterpiece we know today as Fahrenheit 451. It was published initially as The Fireman, a novella version of 25,000 words in the February 1951 issue of Galaxy Science Fiction. But within another year or two, as the McCarthy hearings began to gather momentum in the United States and the climate of fear began to build, Bradbury returned to The Fireman, doubled its length to 50,000 words, and published it under its new title, Fahrenheit 451, the temperature, he found, at which book paper ignites, combusts. It was published by Ballantine Books in the fall of 1953, simultaneously in both paperback mass market printings and also in hardbound printings. This particular first edition issue is the asbestos-bound edition. The binding is a variant on asbestos, sort of a cultural send-up of books being burned, this book being more or less fireproof. There are only about 200 copies of that issue and about 6,000 copies of the hardbound overall, 250,000 copies of the paperback. They sold fairly well, but it was the time of the climate of fear. It got good critical review, but not a lot of public endorsement at the grassroots level. It took 7 years. It wasn't until 1960 that a second printing of the paperback of Fahrenheit was needed. Since that time, Fahrenheit has never been out of print in paperback and is again back in print in both hardback and trade paperback format as well. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, he weathered a plagiarism lawsuit that he had to initiate against a major network because they found the story so compelling that they took it and produced it as a Playhouse 90-minute episode on television without his permission. He eventually won after appeal in federal court. In the mid-1960s, an even stranger thing happened to Fahrenheit. The Ballantine Company decided to provide an issue of Fahrenheit in paperback that had most references to sexuality, alcoholism, insanity, all cursing, all references to God or a deity removed silently from the text without resetting the vast majority of the text around it. This was published as the Bal High School issues in 1967. Bradbury had granted permission, but he never really quite realized what was at stake here and what was going on inside the text of his classic work, and really forgot that this had ever happened. By 1973, however, when the mass market editions for the public went out of press, they were accidentally reset for distribution with only the censored text inside it. So throughout much of the 1970s, you could not buy an uncensored copy of Fahrenheit 451 for schools or for public consumption, and no one knew it. Finally, in the late 70s, some high school students in Missouri and their teacher discovered this, wrote to Mr. Bradbury. He investigated, found out what had happened, and Fahrenheit was restored in the late 70s to its full original text and has not been tampered with since. It was made into a movie by Francois Truffaut in 1966, and most recently in 2013, the 60th anniversary edition was published by Simon & Schuster. Fahrenheit has no no sign of going away, especially now since so many communities include that book in their community reads, and the National Endowment for the Arts includes it in their big read programs throughout the country. 60 years out, Fahrenheit 451 has come to symbolize the importance of literacy and reading in an increasingly visual culture, offering hope that the wonders of technology and the raptures of multimedia entertainments will never obscure the vital importance of an examined life. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and go through the National Endowment for the Arts discussion questions, which I understand you will all be considering during the community read this month during National Library Week. The National Endowment for the Arts has provided a series of 11 questions involving Fahrenheit 451, and we'll work through them now with answers I've come up with after thinking about them from time to time over the last few days. The first question: Montag comes to learn that firemen are rarely necessary because the public itself stopped reading of its own accord. Bradbury wrote his novel in 1953. To what extent has his prophecy come true today? Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is a historical moment. In early 1952, between the time he published The Fireman and then expanded it into Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury began to see people in Los Angeles wearing portable transistor radio earphones, similar to his little seashells, so that they could shut out the world around them. The big wall TV screens would follow over time. These and other very useful wonders of our technology-rich lives can diminish our perceived need for reading. The great cultural casualties in post-war America are essentially quality radio programming, the motion picture movie theater experience, and reading. Adaptation of literature and entertainment to new media, and the drift away from broad-based interdisciplinary education in favor of highly specialized forms of education leave us less time and little perceived need to read. As Bradbury observed, you don't need to burn books, just get people to quit reading them. The second question: Clarice describes a past that Montag has never known, one with front porches, gardens, and rocking chairs. What do these items have in common, and how might their removal have encouraged Montag's repressive society? They are all devices that slow down time and encourage thought. These are all symbols of the world of Ray Bradbury's dandelion wine, nostalgic and filled with memories of shared traditional values, a time when the young respected their elders, where 3 generations of a family might live in the same house or on the same street, rocking on the front porch or gardening in the evenings. They are symbols of the examined life. As Beatty notes about Clarice, she didn't want to know how a thing was done, but why. And of course, that's what made her dangerous in Montag's world. The next question: Don't look to be saved in any one thing, person, machine, or library, Faber tells Montag. Do your own bit of saving, and if you drown, at least die knowing you were headed for shore. How good is this advice? Professor Faber's cautionary tale within Bradbury's timeless cautionary tale centers on the legacy of Faber's own generation. When they needed to act to prevent this kind of brave new world, they failed to respond. They thought that institutions or leaders or the warnings of history and literature and science preserved in the great libraries would save them, but they didn't. Faber knows that action, for better or worse, is the better course for Montag. Remember that the captain belongs to the most dangerous enemy to truth and freedom, Faber says, the solid moving cattle of the majority. Montag must strike out on his own. As Faber observes in his last words of advice through the seashell earpiece, It's now up to Montag to decide for himself which way to jump or to fall. Next question. One of the most significant of the many literary allusions in Fahrenheit 451 occurs when Montag reads Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach. What is the response of Mildred's friends, and why does Montag kick them out of his house? Dover Beach draws meaning from the power of metaphor, the power of reflecting on the shingled shore of possibilities. It's a powerful poem, but for Mildred's companions, the power is terrifying. They have no learning, no experience with poetry, and can only try to understand it literally. They inevitably fail, but will never know the magnitude and tragedy of that failure. Question 5. It may surprise the reader to learn that Beatty is quite well read. How can Beatty's knowledge of and hatred for books be reconciled? Well, behind the destruction of this inverted world where firemen set fires instead of extinguishing them is a very elusive and subtle kind of regulation. One must know the enemy. We are far more effective when we criticize a book if we actually read it first. The great unasked question in Fahrenheit 451, as in Huxley's Brave New World, is the question that Juvenal asked his ancient Roman peers. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Simply, who watches the watchers? But reading also makes us human, and beneath the surface, Beatty knows he has given up the ideas and values that made us human. He's almost a suicidal figure, ready to be burned by Montag's torch. Next question. Unlike Mrs. Hudson, Montag chooses not to die in his house with his books. Instead, he burns them, asserting even that, quote, it was good to burn, quote, and that, quote, fire was best for everything, end quote. Are these choices and sentiments consistent with his character? Are you surprised that he fails to follow her footsteps? We should not be surprised by his actions, for Montag sees a third choice. He can continue to live and feed on his perverted profession, or he can die, but he can also find another way. Can Montag come out on the other side of the modernist crisis of values, scarred, but able to face what Robert Penn Warren called, in All the King's Men, the awful responsibilities of time? His successful search for the book people shows that he can. Beatty's world uses fire to burn everything from books to the newly dead. Fire is bright, fire is clean, Beatty says. Montag finds another way. Question 7. Beatty justifies the new role of firemen by claiming to be, quote, custodians of society's peace of mind, the focus of the understandable and rightful dread of being inferior, end quote. What does he mean by this, and is there any sense that he might be right? Well, regimentation can maintain order in a stress-filled world, along with programmed recreation. This kind of regimentation feeds on a fear of otherness, of difference, a fear of those who question the vast leveling effect of an overpopulated and technologically driven culture. Question 8. How does the destruction of books lead to more happiness and equality according to Beatty? Does his lecture to Montag on the rights of man sound like any rhetoric still employed today? A world fed on trivia and non-combustible facts is a happy one. Books disturb the mind. Books say nothing, Beatty says, nothing you can teach or believe. They're about non-existent people, figments of imagination. If they're fiction, if they're nonfiction, it's worse. You come away lost. Beatty's world is a world without faith or conviction and doesn't even know what's missing. We must all be alike, Not everyone born free and equal, as the Constitution says, but everyone made equal, each man in the image of every other. These are slogans and signposts that predominate in an increasingly polarized culture, as happens in cycles of political and social upheaval. Question 9. Why does Montag memorize the Old Testament's Ecclesiastes and the New Testament's Revelation? How do the final 2 paragraphs of the novel allude to both biblical books? Well, in its early novella form, as the fireman, Montag only recites from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season." In the expanded form of Fahrenheit 451, Montag uses Ecclesiastes as the unspoken frame for his actual words. Yes, all that, but what else? What else? Something, he says. He chooses Revelation chapter 22, the river of the water of life, the tree of life, and leaves for the healing of the nations. For Bradbury, the rocket is symbol of both destruction, as experienced here in Fahrenheit 451, and life, as symbolized by the rockets of his famous fictions of Mars and mankind's journey to the stars. Question 10. Are there any circumstances where censorship might play a beneficial role in society? Are there some books that should be banned? Bradbury believed that censorship rarely surfaces at the national level. It's more of a social phenomenon in America, locally imposed by school boards and library boards, though rarely by librarians. Books are banned or more accurately regulated for age-appropriate reasons, but the courts often strike down decisions where the authorities ban the book because they personally disagree with the ideas in a book. Note the final lines of Bradbury's coda in the back of your copy of Fahrenheit 451. In sum, do not insult me with the beheadings, finger choppings, or the lung deflations you plan for my works. I need my head to shake or nod, my hand to wave or make into a fist, my lungs to shout or whisper with. I will not go gently onto a shelf, degutted, to become a non-book. Question 11. If you had to memorize a single book or risk its extinction, which book would you choose? Well, the books that are dearest to me have combinations of essential characteristics. Each candidate book must be, for me, a book of ennobling sentiment, a book of compelling ideas, a book that helps us understand the world around us, a book that helps us see and remember what makes us human. And the book, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, written and published in 1895. A single man's journey into the far distant future where man has devolved, losing all the complex mental powers and most of the hard emotions that together make us human. Judging by the tendencies in our present world, Wells's time traveler says that such a future is inevitable. But Wells's narrator says, even if this is so, then we must live as if it were not so. This is the book I would save from extinction. Well, thank you very much for having me participate with your community read this year. If you have any questions about what we do here at the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies and Indiana University School of Liberal Arts, or if you'd like to know how you could help out as we begin to accession this wonderful new set of gifts that we have here from Ray Bradbury's personal papers and his library, you can go to our website and we'd be glad to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.